We would like to start with a quote from anthropologist Anna Tsing in her fabulous book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. Beginning of quote, "To listen and to tell a rush of stories is a method." End of quote. What can sentience teach us about politics? Sentience is often tied to human perception and apprehended in the false distinction between thoughts and feelings. As if feelings needed consciousness to find concrete expression, as if the political was primarily a brain's affair. Departing from a definition of politics as that which problematizes the relationship between perception and action, and also from a definition of politics that acknowledges the possibility for organisms to think with their guts, we here question modalities of engagement with sentience beyond the human. In our consideration of sentience, we are cautious of collapses into animism, wary of panpsychism, and wish to evade simplistic misanthropism and anthropomorphism. In an attempt to avoid these pitfalls, we approach the question of sentience by considering scales, from the biological to the cosmic, from the molecular to the planetary, from the microbiome of one to that of many. We ask, how can sentience move across scales? What are the socio-political implications of scaling sentience? Can scalar sentience bring new economies of care? The generic notion of scale is not apolitical. To scale sentience beyond the human is not a shortcut to avoid the politics of situated life. To scale sentience beyond the human is not to act or think without the human. To scale sentience beyond the human is to avoid limiting the world to human perceptual possibilities. It is to acknowledge, and here I'm quoting Isabel Stenger's on Whitehead, that most of our usual abstractions lead us to judge as subjective only. To scale sentience beyond the human is to risk oneself at getting off the scale by adventuring oneself into otherly situated worlds. In our encounters with otherly worlds, we seek to avoid interpretations of perception and ask instead why and how other entities need other worlds, why and how they depend on them, why and how they are conditioned and transformed by them. We also interrogate ecologies of belonging with them. Risking ourselves at bearing too much weight on the scale, our shared objective is constructivist. We wish to create an appetite for these otherly worlds, for their pragmatic differences. In the form of a trialogue, our interventions are structured so that our thoughts are read or spoken in a rotation of sections, so that three perspectives combine and triangulate into a whole. We propose a threefold problematization which, instead of searching for the truth of scaling, performs sentience at different scales. The earth, O'Reilly, the sky, high, and outer space, Boucher, will act as three distinct poetic structuring devices of spatio-temporal sentience. We foresee this threefold writing process as an intervention into collective survival, not to save us, as anthropologist Anna Tsing reminds us, but to open our imagination. In scaling sentience collectively and at a distance in a strange telematic way, no thanks to COVID-19, we are seeking methods that do justice to our collaborations both within and across species.
Thank you very much, Marie-Pierre. I'm an artist currently based in Helsinki. I describe my practice as being both willfully interdisciplinary and entirely undisciplined. I explore speculative reconfigurations of the body, and I employ, among other things, performance, biological media, ecosystems, writing, and installation. Sweat meteorology. Horses sweat. Men perspire. Women glow. I did not mind the arrival of the sudden night sweats that flashed like floods drenching me, despite their disruptive drama. Rather, I enjoyed their excessiveness and sense of abandon. I did not mind being sodden. Somehow it was satisfying, intense, and tropical. Perhaps I found myself unbothered because I was used to sweating like a horse. There was a moment sometime prior to the onset of hormonal deluges when I announced that I sweated like a man when I trained. There was nothing restrained or glowing about my salty drenchings. I poured unrelentingly until sodden, my face becoming red, my hair all over the place. I precipitated, misted and formed clouds. At the end of each training session, as we stood in line, ready to make our final us, we would pour, forming a microclimate from our exertions. Humidities would ascend to the unclattered railway arch, only to return and pool on the mats as cold, briny puddles. In Scene Gender, Kathy Acker wrote, "When I was a child, the only thing I wanted was to be a pirate." I'm 53. For the last several years now, I've been exploring and writing about being environmentally menopausal. I've been thinking about how to reframe menopause and of how to become a pirate. The turbulence of menopause requires sea legs that can move in accordance with changing weather, fortunes, and seas. One is literally out at sea. Uncharted waters over which the normal starry constellations are absent. There are stars, but they are arranged into hitherto unrecognizable orientations. The cardinal points have all shifted. Perhaps the poles have moved to the equator, and Lapland has come to me. Menopause is a series of transitionary states during which hormones soak, saturate and abate in exotic tides. One's very self is up for grabs, and there is no clear sense of anything. This pervasive nonsense is rich and strange ground in which things do not exactly grow, but emerge. In our endocrine altered environments, insides and outsides are subtly permeable. Phytohormones and animal hormones, biochemical molecules that are hormone-like, that masquerade and alter, all travel across and through bodies of plants and animals and ecological relations, as bodies are processes, and processes are transformations of substances and things. Menopause is environmental. Menopause is timely. It is about time. Sweat Protocol 1. Be menopausal, go to bed, throw off covers. Sweat Protocol 2. Hold copper pipe closely in the heat of the day under the hot sun. Glisten. Sweat Protocol 3. Version 1. Hold a cast iron kettlebell, perform swings with it energetically, sweat, salt and water, causing it to rust. Version 2. Hold a cast iron kettlebell, perform swings energetically, perspire clouds that precipitate, causing it to rust. Sweat Protocol 4. Wear a white cotton mutated laboratory coat to the gym. Run and or row into a heavy sweat. Use the coat to absorb the sweat. Bury the sweaty coat in a wild area in the hope that sympathetic microbes will grow with, on and from the sweat. I'm trying to build muscle mass. Pause. I read somewhere that it is the best thing to do for a woman of my age. Pause. Rather than head down the road of a gender-conforming regimen of hormone replacement therapy just yet, I'm trying to manipulate and work with my own physiology and hormonal well-being. Pause. My coach does not appear to like me to refer to menopause. Pause. Or that I am menopausal. Pause. And I am not sure he entirely unintentionally treats me as more frail and with less capacity than I have. Pause. I try to explain that skillful coaching of perimenopausal and menopausal women is an untapped market, ripe for the picking. Pause. That helping women architect muscle to support their well-being as they transition into, through, and beyond menopause and its post is a terrific idea. Pause. And that we make testosterone, that our muscle mass is intimately enmeshed with the delicate production of that culturally affirmative, biologically determinate elixir of androgen prescribing sovereignty. Pause. I feel a little bit condescended to. Pause. But not enough to put me off. Pause. I read about muscle mass and muscle loss. The regulation of muscle mass is of interest to a diverse group of people. There are those, such as power athletes and bodybuilders, who are primarily interested in increasing their muscle mass. Others are concerned with preventing muscle loss. This is critical for the frail, elderly, those with myopathies, cancer, sepsis, HIV/AIDS, and other diseases and conditions, those suffering from reduced mobility as a result of injury, and astronauts. Pause. Astronaut. Pause. Pausalnaut. Pause. Astropause. Pause. Performing a kind of hormonal hack or lack, inquiring of the pervasiveness of estrocentricity. Pause. For estrogenicity is no longer limited to a small group of substances, but can be found in a whole series of chemical classes used daily in agriculture, industrial manufacturing, health, etc. Since the end of World War II, more than 10,000 active substances capable of estrogen activity have been released on the market and used in hydraulic or dielectric fluids for capacitors, transformers, glues, paints, detergents, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, cosmetics, etc. Pause. Marlon R. King and Eva Haywood describe the open potentials of the endocrine landscape created by our medications and industrial common materials, one in which our shared evolutionary history with other animals creates a common vulnerability to the effects of environments, one in which hormone levels change over an individual's lifetime and are affected by lifestyle, stress, physical activity, and exogenous hormones. Even natural plant substances like phytoestrogens interact with endocrine systems of various animals. Our material culture, as expressed by what objects we encircle ourselves with, the food we eat, the water we drink. Pause. R. King and Haywood invoke Bailey Kear's perspective, in which he attends to the ecologically constitutive nature of bodies. He refers to bodies as constant processes, relations, adaptations, and metabolisms engaged in varying degrees of reproductive and economic relations with multiple other bodies, substances, and things. Pause. Astropause. Digging into the tinkering of muscle, its metabolic and hormonal sensitivities. Pause. I lift. Pause. I breathe. Pause. I dig. Other processes are at play at other scales. Microbial, biochemical. Human bodies exert, sweat, steam, and drip. Microbes proliferate on bodies and on surfaces, finding nourishing niches in which to metabolize and expand. Weights rust, sweat clouds precipitate, seemingly immovable materials oxidize and react. Embedded in our human cells, symbiogenetic mitochondria, mosaic organelles of bacterial provenance form an origin evolutionary Eve, metabolize. Muscle fibers fire and twitch in various tempos, slow, fast, intermediate. Satellite stem cells are signaled. They differentiate, line up in multinuclear myotubes. Fibers are formed and muscle is laid. Kathy Acker counts. In her essay, Language of the Body, Kathy Acker writes, I want to shock my body into growth. I do not want to hurt it. I visualize and I count. I estimate weight. I count sets. I count repetitions. I count seconds between repetitions. I count seconds or minutes between sets. From the beginning to the end of each workout, in order to maintain intensity, I continually count. Thank you. And next we have Kathy High.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Kathy High, and I am the head and a professor in the arts department at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, in USA. I'm very happy to be part of this panel with Marie-Pierre and Kira. So I'm going to read my section, which is entitled Sky, Dreams of Becoming Vulture. The first part is a quote from Octavia Butler. Quote, in a very real sense, she was an experimental animal, not a pet. What could Nikenj do for an experimental animal? Protest tearfully when she was sacrificed at the end of the experiment? But no, it was not that kind of an experiment, unquote. That was from Octavia Butler's Lilith's Brood, the Exogenesis trilogy. So what kind of experiments are we engaging in now? What kind of experiments are we conducting with our animals, insects, our air, soil, and water, our oceans, our people, our microbes, our world? We need desperate measures for these times and to think radically about how to proceed, as we are the experimental animals, all of us together. Starting with myself, my diseased body, my body that takes in and expresses all the time. One false move, and I pay for it. Due to my genetically inherited bowel disease, I've been obsessed with my gut for a long time. Developments around gut microbiome research have offered a new paradigm for considering how disease manifests in a body. I think of my gut microbiota. I want to add more bacteria to them, FMT, to further diversify my grouping. What is my optimum microbial cocktail? At the DiPaolo lab, I was able to see my own T cells react to my own fecal matter. Dr. William DiPaolo and I set up our experiment using body materials from me, the sick subject, and Will as the control, the healthy subject. The experiment was the picturing of my own body's dramatic autoimmune reaction. My cells reacted much more dramatically than Will's cells did. It was the first time I could see the way my overactive immune system works against itself. What looks like an angry black dot was in fact the T cells taking over and breaking the other cells. There was something incredibly poetic in that image for me. enabling a new way to consider my health and dis-ease. The image looked like a glitch, static in the system, trouble that happens over and over again, like some transformation. And I realized that perhaps I am not attacking myself through my autoimmunity, but rather I am a mutant, preparing for another time, situating even my ill health as part of a broader environmental entanglement. Will and I did play with our own shit bacteria, plating it side by side in petri dishes, culturing lawns of bacterial microbes. We found anomalies. Will's side of the plates were prolific, abundant. Mine, landscapes of lost microbes, with limited diversity of bacteria. Queer tracings and evidence of my body's makeup. Curiously, scavenger birds, such as black vultures and turkey vultures, also have a limited diversity of bacteria in their gut microbiota. The gastrointestinal tracts of vultures are extremely selective. In an article from Nature Communications published in October 2015 entitled "The Microbiome of the New World Vultures," the authors describe in their introduction, quote, "Vultures are scavengers that fill a key ecosystem niche in which they have evolved a remarkable tolerance to bacterial toxins in decaying meat. Here we report the first deep metagenomic analysis of the vulture microbiome. Through face and gut comparisons of 50 vultures representing 2 species, we demonstrate a remarkably conserved low diversity of gut microbial flora. The gut samples contained an average of 76 operational taxonomic units, OTUs, per specimen, compared with the 528 OTUs on the facial skin. Clostridia and Fusobacteria, widely pathogenic to other vertebrates, dominate the vulture's gut microbiota. Our findings show a strong adaptation of vultures and their bacteria to their food source, exemplifying a specialized host microbial alliance." Unquote. In my short fiction and film in progress that I'm working on now, entitled Lazarus Dreams of Becoming Vulture, set sometime in the near future, the main character is besieged with a chronic inflammatory bowel disease. Her illness has left her gut microbiome in the red. She is deficient of many important bacterial species, suffering from dysbiosis due to intense antibiotic and other drug treatments in her past. Our protagonist partakes in a free clinical trial of a synthetic fecal microbial transplant, FMT, where the colonies of gut microbes are curated and selected for a particular gut profile and disease type. Currently, there is biotech research being conducted on engineering bacteria communities, allowing for designed FMTs, making feasible a programmable microbiome therapy. Once in the treatment, our protagonist is administered an experimental, engineered, synthetic gut microbial cocktail called SynGut. Things turn out strangely. The treatments don't seem to work. She leaves the program. But soon after, our protagonist finds that she has newfound tastes and powers, giving her novel ability to ingest decomposing foods. She recognizes her affinity with vultures and other scavenger animals. What would it be like to take on a vulture gut microbiome? How would that change our relationship to death and to life and to waste and to our sense of ourselves in eternal transformations and cycles of life? Like transgenic hybrid creatures becoming perhaps quote-unquote tranimals, described by Lindsay Kelly and Eva Hayward in their article Carnal Light as, quote, instances within which we can see more closely the appearing and disappearing boundaries between the human, the post-animal, human and non-human, the unhuman, and the animal, unquote. I'm going to read an excerpt from the sci-fi story that I described before, Lazarus Dreams of Becoming Vulture, and it is written in the first person, spoken by the protagonists. I now advise others how to eat. I teach what I learned from my animal colleagues. I administer bacterial drinks and perform FMTs with particular bacteria that I culture and grow in my home laboratory. I train my human teams to clean down to the bone. I'm proud of my troops. We can only work at night or under cover, of course. We help with the flesh at least. I wasn't sure if the sin gut had adapted my gut to accept the toxins or if it was my predisposition, how I was configured before. We now hone certain bacteria and bacteriophages to create our own targeted toxic gut environment. We add and subtract bacteria until we make a perfect, noxious balance. Perfect. Just too perfect. They'd given us the tools and we adapted them. Vultures were our models, our kin. Who knew it would be so neat? The world's food rot was our banquet. Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Marie-Pierre Boucher. Thank you.
On wombs as and spaceships. I would like to start with 3 quotes from Dorian Sagan, issued from his book Biospheres Reproducing Planet Earth. Quote number 1. A disturbing possibility is that future life may exist only inside ecological enclosures, each a kind of biologically miniaturized world. Quote number 2. It is difficult to imagine early humans dreaming of creating materially closed ecosystems. This is a new quest. Quote number 3. Mars would be remade in the image of Earth. What kind of legacy for lifeways do space analogues enable us to imagine? In Biospheres Reproducing Planet Earth, Dorian Sagan writes, and I wonder if he's not an unfaithful son to his mother, Lynn Margulis, when he does so, that Gaia is a living organism and not an emergent property of interaction among organisms. To prove his point, he needs to make Gaia a force capable of producing its own offspring, and he does so with a provocative yet not totally fully assumed suggestion. Understanding the way in which the Earth is using people to reproduce itself, he writes, makes for a story more real and yet more unbelievable than the strangest science fiction. For the first time, he adds, beginning of quote, we recognize our cosmic role as midwives aiding in the gestation, delivery, and development of a new life form, end of quote. Here, Sagan is making Gaia in the image of its capacity to reproduce itself at other scales. He is remaking the Earth in the image of a biological necessity, the function of reproduction, more than he is inventing modalities to greet the potential unknown lifeways that biospheres could produce. From the framing of nature in national parks and space cabins, to the framing of life in petri dishes and glass vessels, the architectures we build to sustain life bear weight on our capacity to tell stories about life. When we travel to space, whether it is imaginatively, scientifically, technically, or emotionally, which reproductive tropes do we bring with us? What kind of economies of for reproduction are we capable of inventing? What kind of perceptual adventures do these tropes and economies make possible? Which traps and pitfalls, as opposed to legitimized forms of knowledge, are we capable of thinking with? To think of life beyond the Earth, or after the image of the Earth, to scale life from the molecular to the cosmic, from the bodily to the planetary, is an adventure that can quickly reify the representation of life, of the human, and of the Earth. Against the modernization and the essentialization of life, often guided by ideals of progress and domination, can we, and here I quote anthropologist Anat Singh, develop techniques to look around rather than ahead? The first premise here is that one cannot think about planetary futures without thinking about bodily futures at the same time. As much as the delocalization of human beings in outer space has changed our representation of the Earth, the delocalization of the embryo in petri dishes and the delocalization of ecosystems in biospheres has modified both our representation of reproduction and our economies of reproduction. how do these delocalizations and shifts in representation affect our modes of political organization? The second premise is that if we don't know what a body can do, how can we know what the spaces within which it moves can? Would the scaling of a body, of a world, of an infrastructure, or of a planet provoke a total reconfiguration of their milieu? In a discussion with artist Lucy McCree, creative director of BioGinkgo Christina Agapakis provocatively asked, can one consider the uterus an onboard printer? Following from Agapakis, can we grasp/capture the body as a spaceship and scale it up to interplanetary life? What could the power of the body in the making of interplanetary architectures? What could be the power of the body in the making of interplanetary architectures and infrastructures? Could we, in this scaling context, consider the artificial uterus a biosphere at small scale? And conversely, the biosphere or uterus at large scale? What modes of existence and lifeways would be carried from one scale to another? How could we scale the qualitative differences between these analogues into forms of political interest? The scaling effects generated by analog architectures delocalize lifeways and works as powerful tricks to make or remake a unified and already known image of the body and of the earth. Not only pre-given and unified, but also fragmented. To scale is an activity that can bring you up and down, in and out. In Alien Ocean, anthropologist and colleague Stefan Elmreich reminds us of the distinction between romantic and baroque visions of complexity, as articulated by philosopher Chung-Ling Kwa to describe microbiology. Romantic visions, Elmreich explains, gaze upward to a unified, integrated, overarching, holistic system like Gaia. Baroque approaches to complexity, in contrast, tunnel downward to the intricate, convoluted, endlessly and multifariously recombining. These visions, and also those associated with overviews and views from nowhere, are sadly often, beginning of quote, embedded in mapping practices dedicated to owning and controlling territory, end of quote. How then do we come to validate our scaling practices? How do we come to valorize what they tell us about lifeways and their geopolitics, and also about our capacities of imagination? Can analogues produce unforeseen images of the body and of the earth, create resonances rather than rationalities, and give rise to lifeways that challenge our imagination? How shall we take care of this scaling problem? Teaching us how to take care of problems, to live constructively with them, in and through their ruins, Tsing challenges us to remember the pitfalls of scalability. Scalability, she tells us, is the ability to make one's research framework apply to greater scales without changing the research questions. It is, beginning of quote, creating an expansion without the distortion of changing relations, end of quote. Informed by the meaning of the word scale, could we instead think of scales as shelters of thought, as hosts of lifeways, as the layer around a bud or the scale of snakes and fishes? Could we think of scaled analogues as more than variations on models? That is, as something that resembles nothing outside of itself, as something that is self-referenced to its own variations? Here I was quoting Brian Masumi. Could we think of scaled analogues as operators of transformation, as generators of social difference, rather than as predictive models of comparison? The exchanges among and between designs for and of the earth are axiologically charged, creating a sort of opaque oscillation between environmental and bioethics. What kind of ethics are fostered when we anticipate and practice maneuvering in places like the lunar and the Martian landscapes? For biologist Henri Atlan, bioethics is a field of practice, is a field whose questions are asked to society by biology and not the contrary, meaning that if the questions are asked by biology, biology alone cannot answer them, even if it plays a central role in their formulation. Referencing the social and political status we give to embryos when we grow them in vitro, Atlan tells us that in our encounters with analogues, Instead of searching for a criterion of scientific origin, we should accept a criterion of law based upon our sensibility and our immediate perception. It is this immediacy of perception, he explains, that we should recover and assume instead of searching for an illusory essentialist definition of nature and of human persona. To scale analogues should thus be similar to thinking par le milieu, in the midst of objective research, scientific facts, and nature on the one hand, and between justice and dignity on the other. While justice and nature are two domains that are hardly reconcilable, Atlan urges us to remember that sensory experience can lead to the production of ethical values endowed with the power to maintain the social value of this impossible reconciliation. This impossibility should, however, not be read as an opposition, but rather as a contrast that produces social differences. To scale analogues is thus to gamble on the possibility to live inside of this regime of the human and still exceed it. To scale analogues is a form of experience, a lived abstraction that emerges in the immediacy of perception, one that vibrates in the concrete, one that makes the scale effects localizable in space and time. It is a method that aims at generating sources of signification which situate us and which give meaning to our existence. It is thus a practice that should carry the fabulatory function of inventing new lifeways. Back to collective survival. We have read and listened to with each other and to with our stories. Whether we sweat like horses, share the diversity of our gut bacteria with vultures, or produce interplanetary offspring, we came together not to debate or interpret the question of scaling sentience, but to collectively attach ourselves to discern it. We came together through our concerns because we seek to construct problems with meaningful legacies.
Hi, welcome to this wonderful panel. I hope you've enjoyed the presentations, and I'm looking forward to discussing with Kira and Kathy, and later on Marie-Pierre, if she will be able to join us, more about discerning the sentience of scaling. Welcome, Kathy. Welcome, Kira.
Hello, Marta. Hello, Kira. Hello, everyone.
Yeah. So we already have a question for Kathy. Thank you so much for this presentation, everybody. The question is by Philippe, and he asks, he would love to hear your thoughts on the loss of the microbia and how it affects the loss of identity. Kathy.
Hi. Thank you for that question. It's a really interesting one. I think that for a long time I had thought about this loss of diversity in bacteria, my gut bacteria, as a kind of, dampening, shall we say, of my identity, a kind of limitation. I've grown up this way. And I think this is the way that a lot of people are taught to think about chronic diseases and your diseased state. And I think that we're in a moment when a lot of people are going to be suffering, a lot more people are going to be suffering from chronic responses to the virus that we have with us now. So I think that it's time to rethink these conditions into new ways of considering them. I know that there's a certain kind of care that we have to take of ourselves. It's sort of a new sense of our bodies and of our limitations. But I think that we can look at these limitations as a kind of strength. And as we've all had to get used to a different sense of time and a different sense of place, during this pandemic. I think that there's ways that we can also rethink these so-called limitations that we have into new possibilities and into new ways of being able to work with each other and support each other. And so while my, fiction, my sort of speculative fiction obviously goes off in a very sort of, funny direction with this taking on vulture, maybe that's possible. I don't know, but I think that it'd be really interesting to look at other models that exist in nature that do work with these more limited either groupings of gut bacteria or other such things. So thanks for your question. I thought it was great.
We have a lot of questions coming up. Thank you everybody for being so engaging. This one is for Kira, is by Stephanie, and she's wondering, in what creative ways can we make these bodily processes less taboo, less about ageism, and more about everybody's shared experience? Because in reality, everyone is affected. Children, parents, etc., have to participate in this life process. Kira. Are you there? Kira, did you hear us? Oops, Kira is off. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
I can. Did you hear the question? Should I ask it again?
I heard the beginning of it to do with the sense of how can we talk about things that are often culturally considered taboo, but yet affect many of us or all of us, and then it cut out. What was the rest of the question?
Well, this is pretty much it. It's in reality, everyone is affected: children, partners, and everybody.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure how much I've thought about that in relation to this in terms of taboo. Taboo seems to me so specific to different cultures and different places, different locations, I suppose, have different constructs of what is taboo and how to approach taboo. And I'm very struck by, since I've been working on menopause, there's been this absolute sort of tidal wave of publications which get reviewed in places like The Guardian, the British Broadsheet, and the New York Times, these very kind of middle class readerships, and books that are very sort of seem to be very sort of positive about menopause. And I still find myself getting a little, that's great, but I'm a little grumpy with it, with these writings, because I feel like that they're so centered in a very individual experience of being human. And I suppose I'm interested in the more complex, extended what it is to be human, but also with non-human across scales, from the molecular to the vast. I'm not sure if you got any of that. It looked like I was cutting out, and if the connection was going completely. So I suppose my interest is in the sense of processes and maybe alliances, creating connections across those scales as well. So I think that does several things. I think that reinforces and brings up some completely new taboos, as well as perhaps dissolving some others, to think of oneself as somehow dancing with a kind of a molecular hormonal jouissance that is not one's own, that is distributed and that moves across and I'm using that phrase molecular jouissance because it came up in a conversation recently with Adriana Nouf when she was preparing for a performance that she gave the other day in Ljubljana, and then used within her performance as well. And I found that it was, we were talking a certain amount about menopause's transition and how cis women and trans women might find all sorts of really important communications and alliances on that level to talk about, particularly as there are different different hormonal therapeutic, different HRTs that are used, that have been developed for menopausal women, that then are used by trans women. So we were kind of, you know, speculating. I hope Adriana doesn't mind me making reference to that, about those alliances or about those commonalities. So I think taboo is something that's sort of tricky. It's on one hand reinforced and dissolved at the same time, maybe, but that's all a little baggy, but maybe that's what I've got to say on that at the moment.
Thank you. The next question is for Marie-Pierre, so we'll wait on that one until she comes back. Hopefully she will not take very long. And the question after that is by Andrea, and Andrea is asking, I'm interested in your thoughts on scaling temporality of these systems to bring things into the human range. How do you deal with that in your works? And right now, any of you can tackle that if you're ready.
I've got a little something to say to that, which I found very inspiring, actually, in a writing by Erich Berger recently called The Scope of the Real, where he, gosh, I hope I'm not misquoting him, Eric, I apologize if I misunderstood, even though I was one of the editors of that writing. But he refused the invitation to understand within the human realm. And instead, there's this more sense of how to not bring other scales into the human, but how to try and understand outside of the human somehow. And I found that a very important sensibility to take on. And I was thinking about it this afternoon in respect to, you know, the fact that right now I'm on this little island and I'm surrounded by dynamic processes of weather, of geology. So, you know, the story that you get on as soon as you get on this island is, you know, well, the ice age happened and blah, 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 and you're here as a consequence of that. So there's these sort of umpteen myriad of processes that are surrounding me with the microorganisms that are living on the rocks, that I was exploring some of their presences today. So I think rather than trying to bring these into a human window, there's something more about trying to acknowledge windows and openings and framings that can't be sensed, but that are sensing, and that the sensing is reciprocal. It's not just about sensing, but it's about it's not just about human sensing and human sentience, but it's this other, acknowledging other sentiences, including non-human ones, which one might not ever measure. Anyway, there's Marie-Pierre, wonderfully.
There's Marie-Pierre. We knew she was coming. You need to unmute yourself, dear.
I just wanted to say that in Quebec, we don't have high-speed internet everywhere, so this is the proof.
Kathy, do you want to comment on the question, or shall we just go on?
Sure, I would love to, but I think it'd be great also to hear from Marie-Pierre about this question too. So maybe
I will repeat.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so we're at the question of that Andrea asked, where I am interested in your thoughts on scaling temporality of these systems to bring things into the human range. How do you deal that in your works? Marie?
In the human range?
Yes.
Well, I mean, right now I'm trying to. This is one of the comments I guess we try to make in the introduction about how myself, of course, most of the stuff I'm going to see is like influenced by my dear hero, like of all times, Isabel Stengers. But it's the idea of like, let's say, if we think about the Anthropocene these days, often we think about it as we render the human, we become misanthrope. We don't like the human in the way, we don't include the human. It's like the human is wrong. So there's some sort of misanthropism. How do I say that? Misanthropism. Well, yeah. So it's the idea of like, can you include the human without reducing the scale of temporality or to human temporality? So this is a central question, I guess, in all of our work, your work too, Marta. It's the way to engage the human in a way that we give problems with great legacy to people who come, but in a way that we don't reduce everything to a human-centric approach.
Kathy?
Yeah, I think that these guys have summed it up very well. But I also am very aware at this moment of how for myself, I'm looking both backwards and forwards. So I think that we're really in a deep crisis right now with this pandemic, so that we're obviously looking back to other pandemics and other times when that's happened to humans. So there is a way that as humans, we are beginning to think outside of the sort of lifespan, our own lifespan, but to think through these sort of larger histories that have affected humans, but then also as a result of that does carry us into thinking about these other kinds of scales that Kira mentioned, for example, with, looking at just geological changes over time in general. And then I love that quote from Erich Berger, because that's such a beautiful way of acknowledging the need for us to look to the sort of biological and non-human or more than human sense of time and the geological, and not put it just in our scale, but to really acknowledge that there are so many different kinds of temporalities that are so incredibly rich to sort of spend time with, that I'm caught these days thinking about them, like looking at a hummingbird, looking at a moth that was just in my room, and how those lives exist in a different kind of frame of time. And I want to understand more about that, and it's really just always going to elude me. It's always going to be something that's just out there that I can't quite get, but I will continue trying till my dying breath. So
that was very beautiful, though. It's a good thing to look forward to, I think. So just so that I don't forget anybody, Marie-Pierre, there's a question for you by Jean Dubois, and it is: how do you envisage the expansion of the problems of the conquest, colonization, and exploration of natural resources in cosmic space at the very moment when we are denouncing them on a terrestrial scale?
Yeah, well,
Sorry.
I think...
And did you understand anything?
Yeah, I think it's a central thing. One of the first thing I think is we have to learn a new vocabulary to engage with all of these. So for instance, just thinking about resource might be a wrong way, because resource means something that can be exploited. So like the idea of being exploited is already turning resources into something wrong. So perhaps we have to invent new ways of attachment or belonging. And I think going to outer space, even though it might be scary or a little bit like contradictory to the kind of like problems we have right now on Earth, I think it might not be the possibility of going there technically, or at least scientifically or imaginatively. And it's important to think about when we think about conquest or the new frontier. What are the tropes do we bring with us? Do we reproduce the colonial discourse, or can we undo it? So it's more like how could I say? It's more like a trial, or like a test, or a challenge, let's say. So thinking about outer space exploration and inhabitation would be a challenge to the way we're used to do. So it's when we travel there, we reproduce economies of care, gender problems. I like to always give the same example when I speak about that. So basically, when the International Space Station was assembled, the Russian and the American module, none of the space agencies wanted to embody the female part of the assembly. So they had to use an androgynous peripheral assembly system as a docking system. So this is an example of how we bring gender bias in space through technology. So how gender bias are translated within technology. So I think it's an exercise that we have to do to think about, let's say if we think about land and property and ownership in relationship to the cosmos, can we move beyond our incapacities on Earth? Can we meet perhaps the poverty of our conceptualizing schema, so that we can engage differently with these issues? So I think for me, it's more, I understand it's a contradiction for lots of people that we have so many problems already on Earth. Why would we even dare or bother going to space? For me, we are already in space because most of the technology we use on a daily basis is based on satellite technology. More what we're doing right now actually is based on outer space. So we're already living in outer space. So how do we want to engage with that in the present? So thank you for this question. It's a really good one. Marta, we can't hear you.
Oh, this mute, unmute is a little bit of an exercise. Okay, so Jill Scott has another question. She agrees with Kathy, and she asks, what about the analogies that can be drawn from biology on teamwork and interdependence? There is a lot of lessons for us humans there.
Yes, true. I'm just thinking back to a new piece that Anna Lindemann has just made about ants, called The Colony. Yeah, and she's very, very, very interested in what ants bring to us in terms of these kinds of models, and the kind of problematics of it too. I don't know as much about ants. I have been a beekeeper, and have been able to witness the issues around bees. That's quite interesting in terms of this sort of life-death cycle, obviously, but also what happens with protecting the queen being the one who sort of really has this oversight to the hive, and actually, you know, it's her pheromones that draw the bees back to the exact right spot of the hive, even if you have multiple hives next to each other. So it's quite an amazing. And then there's all kinds of issues around even discussing the genders of the different bees, because it's really disputed as to whether all the worker bees are female really, and things like this. So these kinds of models, I think, do ask us, if we look at them, to rethink how we can interact, think about swarming behaviors of certain kinds of birds, how they are able to negotiate that kind of travel without colliding with one another. You know, I certainly could not do that, but that's a talent that would be amazing to witness. So this goes back, I think, to something that was coming up in the panel that you moderated, Jill, which was this, maybe I'm mistaking it, sorry if I am, but this question of biomimicry that you were talking about a day or two ago. And so that's a really interesting thing for us to be looking at, in terms of instructing us. And I think that you all at your panel got into a really interesting moment where you're talking about sort of architectures beginning to think about biomimicry and the models within nature that, you know, that we could follow and that would help us in terms of heating our houses or systems of water distribution, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this can go on quite a bit. I also think, well, I'll just leave it there and I'll let my colleagues jump in on that because it's a rich question. Thank you.
Anybody else wants to comment?
Kira, did you want to say anything?
I think she's, oh.
You go for it. My connection cut out, so I didn't hear the question.
Well, myself, I've been wondering for several, I think we, the four of us have been wondering about these analogies between living systems and social realities and political realms and how the biological can be political and not just some sort of like empty signifier that we kind of enliven a system or an organism or something, like where giving space for new life ways would be kind of like. So the idea perhaps for me is that in my own work, what I realize is that most of the abstractions that or the analogies are not abstract enough. They're too close to some sort of bias or common sense that we're used to have, that we want to respect, that we don't want to see as a constraint, more as an obligation. Or, but for me, it's the idea of like, perhaps inventing new life ways rather than life forms. So it's the analogies I think we use are very important, and they're all politically charged. I like, again, Isabel Stengers when she says that every time we use the biological reference, we scramble all the scales, so it makes no sense anymore. So what is biological time, and can it be transposed or translated into an architectural system, for instance? But these are very interesting questions. But for me, I think most of the time, the analogies are too one-to-one scale. We have to scale them up or down, but there can be like some sort of direct transfer.
I think the other thing that's striking me with this conference is this real acknowledgement of the fact that we have, you know, so many different ways that we sense and are in the world, and that's something that we also really can learn as we look at other models, I think, because you know, here we are, we're so tied to this sort of visual and oral mode of relating to each other, and we're missing the smell of each other and the touch, obviously. But, you know, these kinds of ways of just like, and I think back to Pauline Oliveros and her, and I think Johannes was talking about this yesterday in his panel about this deep listening that Pauline practiced, and this way of really being able to resonate with deep energies that are in the universe. They're in the world, obviously, but they're also in the universe. Going back to Marie Pierre's, you know, spatial analogies. They're, you know, these are kinds of ways that physicists and even diviners or dowsers understand the geopolitics, but also the geoenergies of the world. So I think these things go hand in hand. And the thing that's quite beautiful about this conference is that it's beginning to open, you know, we're coming to this sort of like general conversation, admitting that this is something we all are sharing, and that we are understanding this as we're going forward, at least as one small group. But I think that this is important. I think it's a really important moment.
Yeah, and I think also one of the other things that from the question, which strike me as something very powerful that I think I didn't hear that much in biological analogies, is the idea of not using biological analogies to create some sort of system or design, but to create relationships and friendship and companionship, something that we really need in academia, where like we work with meritocracy rather than like adventure or imagination, and like, you know, there's no such thing as like everybody helping each other or some sort of support or parasitic relationship, of course, but in the symbiotic sometimes. So like, I think this idea of looking for biological models as some sort of prototypes or frameworks for collaborations is something very powerful.
I agree. This is a beautiful sentiment. And actually, thinking about that, Stephanie has would like to hear from all of you if you can speak on the temporal and geographic possibilities of using sci-fi and fairy tale as a way of achieving any of this.
I have to say I read this paper by Lou Cornell, who's like a First Nation scientist working in, well, she was based in NYU, but she's been working a lot. She's been publishing very interesting and provocative work, and she has this one paper called Star Space Indian, like that she writes NDN as a play on words to play with the idea of like being called an Indian or not. But she says that that for me was something very challenging. She says that science fiction developed more or less at the same time as imperialism, or so there was some sort of imperial relationship going on. So like the idea of expansion so what science fiction would be for her, some sort of continuation of the colonial tropes. So science fiction wouldn't be something that could necessarily like not save us, but like maybe help us. But for her, it's something that we have to be very careful in the way we engage with it, like because the tropes are in close connection with colonial tropes. So for me, I love science fiction and I love fairy tales and storytelling as a way of maybe getting out of the heterodoxy of academia or orthodoxy of academia. But at the same time, I like when people challenge me in saying that this is not an easy avenue. Like, so it's also politically charged.
Absolutely. It's a minefield. Kathy, would you like to comment, or Kira?
Kira, do you want to go first? No? I agree with you, Marie-Pierre, and the sentiments that you were talking about around the sort of reinstatement of colonialist ideas in a lot of science fiction. I also think of someone like Octavia Butler, who kind of falls beyond that, I think, in a really interesting way. And she's someone whose work I keep returning to. And I just found this really wonderful article, and I'm forgetting the name of the author. Oh dear, I will look it up and tell you in a minute. But and Octavia Butler was researching in the 80s, and she lived in Los Angeles, and she used to travel via public transportation, both to her job and to the library to do research. And if anybody knows public transportation in Los Angeles, particularly thinking about the 80s, she had a lot of time on her hands. So this is where she did a lot of her work. And she was actually researching slime mold, for example, in the 1980s. And she was researching slime mold in a way that also contested, was really interested in these kind of multivariant ways of thinking about slime mold as a kind of, and these are my words, not hers, a kind of trans creature, in that it's single cell and multi-cell at once. So she calls slime mold its selves, is the term she uses. Butler does, and I find this to be really quite astounding, because she understood how this creature can go between being a single, and maybe this gets back to Jill's question earlier too, this sort of single-celled organism, and then also operating in this way that has a sense of its whole self, of many selves at the same time. And at the same time, Butler was also not interested in looking at slime mold as this kind of intelligent creature that could, you could put up little tasks for it to trace the map of the best map of the subway system, which it's used for all the time, and it does come up with these ingenious responses. But it's also like a little bit of a puppy in the circus, like let's give it some other sense, like what can it do on its own? And that's something where Octavia then took that into thinking about her characters and thinking about the creatures that she created in her writing, that took us as readers into another way of understanding these other kinds of systems and beings that exist, that we could think about. And at the same time, she did problematize the racial and colonialist ethics, if you will, going forward in her work. She was really careful to point out those problems and bring them to the forefront. So I think that it's important to think about how we can use colonialism in science fiction to critique it at the same time. And I obviously love science fiction. I teach it, and I'm very interested in looking at it as a mode of speculation. So.
Thank you. Kira, we're posting the questions on our little private chat. So if you want to have a look at what is there, it's one way to access if you can't hear us. But did you hear this particular question and would like to comment, or?
I didn't hear the question, no.
Oh,
but
okay.
It's okay. I very much enjoyed hearing what Marie-Pierre and Kathy had to say, so I think it's fine.
Okay, so one last question that I see, because I don't see any others there, on the chat is, can you maybe also reflect on recent discoveries of possible bacterial life in Venus's atmosphere, and what would the possibility of a life form independent of Earth mean?
Well, I have the feeling it's for me.
You think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, I have to say, like, every time that there's a discovery about NASA, like the big day, like the announcement and stuff, I'm always a little bit hesitant to be like welcoming, if you like. So I met this Earth scientist, planetary scientist, when I was a postdoc at MIT, Tanya Bosbach, and she was telling me that, for instance, when people found water on Mars, nobody took the time to see it was salted water. So like people get super excited about water on Mars, but like we can't do anything with it. So it's not really. It's one thing to find some sort of like chemical components of life, but what does it mean for our understanding of life? So are we ontologizing life, or romanticizing it, or reducing it to a bunch of chemical elements? What kind of life ways or life forms or life modes of attachment do we want? So for me, it's not being a scientist, I find these discoveries interesting for how they enable us to define or conceptualize or understand life in the context of where we live. So I think it's interesting to see. I'm pretty. I have the feeling that there's some extremophiles or like life forms somewhere in the. They actually found 24 planets that would be that are super far from our solar system, but that would be more hospitable to life than Earth. So I don't think that there's no life in whatever form it might take. But I think for me the interesting part of it is to reflect on what it enables us to say about life, or does it condition, limit, or expand our understanding of life. But I think it's an interesting discovery. But I'm wondering about if we already know what we're looking for in space. I'm not sure what's the value of it. So I'm, like finding, wow, we found life. This is life. We can recognize it's life. Beyond knowing that there's life beyond us, I don't think it enables us to attach or engage with the world in a more critical or creative way.
Very true. I'm in perfect agreement with you. Thank you for that. So there's no more questions popping up. Now we have the chance to actually talk to each other if we want. If anybody wants to to make a comment on what you were showing us here, because we're actually listening to pre-recorded videos. I loved what you brought to the table. I was thinking about adaptive strategies all the time with all of your presentations. I was thinking of adaptation because I think it's also something that we're doing right now in terms of global crisis. We are being forced to adapt and to think about adaptation as actually a very present mode of survival, of coming through in the other end. I love, I do associate it very much with what Kira was saying. I think transformation is something that is very important, and we keep forgetting that we are always under some form of transformation. So I would like to hear your thoughts about these.
Well, myself, I think the adaptation is interesting. Outside of the adaptationist paradigm, right? So like it's a matter for us to understand that the environment doesn't doesn't tell us how to behave, right? So in biology, there was always this idea that the environmental pressures were so high that the biological organism would only adapt to these conditions. So for us, I guess it's an invitation to see adaptation as something, and I know my dear friend Kira does it very well. So adaptation as something transformative, as something fleshy, bodily, as something that you feel, as something that you want to suffer from, perhaps, or at least une épreuve, you know, a trial, kind of. So I think it's interesting for us to see that this environment, or like this extension of Zoom or whatever platform we use as some sort of this new associated milieu that we have to deal with, doesn't become what we have to adapt to. We have to adapt this situation to something else. So I think your question is really important, and it's really hard because I know that the four of us, at least, and lots of people probably in the chat, I don't know who is there, but we are a kind of a family together, and we are used to use each other as much beyond adaptation, but as creative adaptation to resist the kind of constraints imposed by whatever milieu we have to deal with. So we miss that a lot, of course. So it's a matter for us to find creative ways. So again, it's a matter, the idea of making this analogy between living systems and forms of collaborations or companionship is, again, something very dear, I think, central to these questions of scaling sentience.
Yep.
Well, I would love, I don't know if Kira can hear us, but I would love to hear from Kira, but if you can, but I also really appreciate that question too. And what you were just saying, Marie-Pierre, makes me think about the term that you used in the introduction or the conclusion of our talk, which was about the economies of care. And I think that this is this is a way that we have found, literally, the we here and others, to begin to, maybe it gets back to Marta's question about adaptation, but also to survive, just to survive, and we have found ways to survive by literally taking care of one another and supporting one another. And I think that this is goes into networking and all kinds of things, but it's a way to, and again, this is a sort of extended family. This is a new family. Like we can recreate this family at any point in time, which is really refreshing. So because sometimes the family you're born into, you're like, oh, it's a little frustrating. We don't agree on anything. But in this family, we don't agree on a lot of things, but we still can, duke it out, and survive. So anyway, I'm just going off, buying time, hoping that Kira can join in, but it's okay. It's a family. It's economies of care is this question of sort of sharing love and fear and vulnerabilities with each other.
Are you able to say something, Kira, or?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I have very much to say to that. Of course, it's a magnificent question, and both Kathy and Marie-Pierre's responses are fantastic and fascinating. It's I think something that's been enormous this year, but also is very much part of the presentation I gave, is something, it really began with, a few years ago, which is, what is it to be within uncharted territory. So that was one of the first sort of concepts, this kind of anti-concept almost, that I started working with when I was thinking about the endocrine molecular transformations and transitions, this lack of cognition, that there's a cognitive dissolve, because it's partial, it appears and disappears and reappears, and it's somatic, but it's somatic in that it's also an expanded sense of the somatic. It's not just the individual body, it's expanded and extended. And so that territory of what is it to navigate the unknown territories includes the idea that the constellations and the markers aren't present. The precedents are no longer there. So all one can do is kind of, try, is enter into uncharted territory and rely on one's sea legs, rely on accumulated wisdoms, and for those to be tactical in many, many ways, that there is a sense of those have accumulated through numerous methods, including ones that are idiosyncratic, perhaps a little bit criminal, non-institutional, not approved, that somehow lie in outside of what's sanctioned or outside of what one's comfortable with. So that I've been thinking about that a lot over the past few months, how that kind of, those sensibilities have become very even more important to me somehow, and that adaptation isn't always a conference or a conferring of tidiness or cuteness, or my feelings are going to be unruffled somehow. So there's a kind of psychology that I suppose I'm thinking about, that on one hand is sort of liberatory, but is messy and dark and dirty and difficult and painful, and of course, in saying that, I have to acknowledge how uneven that is, how ridiculously, tragically, and painfully uneven that is. That means very different things for different bodies, different beings, different individuals. And I'm also aware that it's wonderful to be for a moment at a conference, but I think for many of us there's in terms of other humans, there's extreme isolation, and so part of the adaptation for me certainly is to literally live with non-human companionships, and to kind of think and be with those, and again, then I come back to not just what I sense, but who and what is sensing me, and that becomes, that's part of my daily walking around this island and being in this island, is acknowledging that I am sensed by that which I cannot even perhaps recognize or see. So part of my adaptations, or the adaptations I'm thinking about, is into this profound emptiness. And I don't mean a sort of void, nihilistic emptiness at all. I mean something that is just, it has not formed into language yet, has not formed into even morphologies yet. So, and I find that very, what's the word? Tantalizing as well. There's a texture with that, but it's not comfortable. But that doesn't mean it's bad, but it's not comfortable.
Thank you. It is wonderful to listen to you, Kira, no matter what. It just is. And I always learn, which is one of my favorite things. We're almost done, but we can I don't know, would you like to wrap up, or shall we talk about something else? Any more comments you would like to do?
No, I just from me, a big thank you to you three, and also a big thank you to all the people who I can't see who are out there. So, and just to acknowledge that it's very special to be able to do this as well, very remarkable. So thank you to everyone.
They're saying thank you back.
Especially those on the Eastern time, like who woke up at 8:30.
It is a little bit early for you.
I know. Thank you everybody for coming this early. It's pretty amazing.
On time.
But I also have to say thank you to everybody here on this panel, because as I listened back to the presentation before, as it was starting, it was so great, because it's just you all are just so inspiring, and it's so it's just so wonderful to be able to work with you all. So thank you for doing this.
I want to say the same thing, because I have to say, like, I feel quite privileged to have had the pleasure of working on this with you, because we had several meetings before, we exchanged our texts, we thought collectively, we actually helped supported each other for real, which doesn't happen often in academic conferences. So I would like to thank everybody who's there, but also the three of you for being such great artists.
Yeah. Well, and Marta, thank you for doing it.
I would also like to thank the three of you. It is wonderful to be always on a journey with the three of you, or with any of you. You prepared an absolutely wonderful presentation, and you made us all think deeply about some very important issues that are, sometimes uncomfortable, but very much adventures. And it does always feel with you guys that it is an adventure to discover, to experience, to move forward, to grow, to learn. And not always nice or comfortable, or it sometimes involves pain, but growth also involves pain most of the time. So it is better to do it with you than to do it alone. So, and it would be much harder to do it alone anyway. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you for the wonderful questions and provocating thoughts. And thank IZEA as well for hosting us and being, and the tech team has been exceptional at making everything work. So I'll hope to see you soon. And we continue on working together for sure.
Yes.